engaging in a philosophy as different than psychology really is sort of a modern phenomenon. Like even well into the 19th century, people really didn't make these distinctions. This is really kind of an advent of the 20th century career-based university with disciplines and subdisciplines and the rest of this. But it does seem to be unusual for people that are sort of in the academic world. Why would you want to combine those two things, right? One is especially if you're doing something like analytical philosophy, though applied ethics may be a bit more conducive to psychology. But how are you marrying those two subfields now? Which again, in the past, no one would have asked that question, but now we kind of have to for institutional reasons. So how are you going about doing that?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I didn't get into practical and applied ethics except for by chance when I was at Oxford studying experimental psychology. So when I was an undergrad, I think I maybe I took a philosophy of religion class, but we were mostly studying metaphysical questions about reasons for believing that God exists and so forth. I don't
Mhm.
actually know if I took an ethics class. And I signed up for Shelley Kagan's normative ethics class, and I wasn't admitted that year because it was overbooked or something
Mhm.
like that. So I actually don't think I took an ethics class. So the connection that I saw between philosophy and psychology was born of a couple of different experiences. One was that we were studying in philosophy questions about free will and consciousness and the unconscious mind and how you'd make sense of agency in terms of unconscious mental processes and how that
Mhm.
maps onto certain conceptions of free will. And I was taking some psychology classes at the same time where we were also using words like will and agency and consciousness and unconsciousness, but it seemed to be that they were maybe talking about something different. I mean, one way of characterizing what's going on in psychology is at least there's an attempt to land on certain types of concepts and research questions that are, at least in principle, amenable to being tested with evidence that you could go gather and find out whether your idea is supported or
Mhm.
refuted. Whereas in philosophy, we just weren't interested in data at all. I mean, you could have all these fabulous thought experiments and which is not to disparage philosophy. One thing that I saw was going on in philosophy and not so much in psychology was um, a real commitment to rigorous thinking and to being very careful about when you're drawing an inference inappropriately and really clarifying what your hidden assumptions are and bringing those to the surface and so forth. So to me, it seemed quite obvious that you should want to combine the rigorous conceptual analysis that was going on in analytic philosophy, especially with respect to things like free will and consciousness and so forth,
Mhm.
with the empirical spirit of psychology, which is trying to formulate questions in such a way that you could test them. So it's not just a matter of thought experiments. So it seems like quite a natural thing to combine. And I remember being struck by how strange it was that these were in separate departments. I thought, why aren't these folks talking to each other? Then, of course, I came across an interdisciplinary program during my undergraduate degree in cognitive science, which kind of, all the bells went off that this was the way to do it because I forget what my sub components were, but it was like 4 philosophy classes and 3 psychology classes and 2 neuroscience classes and a linguistics class and an anthropology class or something like that. And you could kind of weave that all into one interdisciplinary major that's all
Mhm.
about how does the mind work? How does this work? And you could focus on things. I think I focused on unconscious mental processes was what my senior thesis was on. So yeah, you're right to say that these topics have been artificially separated because of disciplinary considerations and what gets funded. And there's a period coming out of post-war funding where psychology wanted to be a science because science
Money.
got money,
Yeah.
and so that meant doing statistics. And so you have some funny seeds planted for some of the current crisis in psychology because a lot of the statistical methods that were developed were coming from like agricultural science being applied to humans and psychology experiments with assumptions that it wasn't clear were being met in the case of the topics being studied by psychologists. And so um, we're still having a bit of a statistical crisis in psychology where you have different camps and schools of thought duking it out and figuring out, are we warranted in drawing certain kinds of conclusions under conditions of uncertainty using these statistical tools that we've adopted for largely historical reasons. So
Right.
that's persists.
No, I think that that's a really good point. That because the way that you're talking here, I don't want to say it sounds like Freud because that sounds like demeaning or dismissive or whatever, but it sounds like the way in which psychology was thought about in the early 20th century. You even see it in Jung, you see it in like Eric Newman, this sort of trend that comes from Nietzsche that like has a hard stop in 1955 and it just doesn't go further than that. It sort of has a cul-de-sac because of the positivism that gets introduced in social science broadly. And I'd like to go into some of that maybe in a couple of minutes, because I
Sure.
think it's really worth getting into. Because my discipline is in political science, so we certainly rode on that train too. Usually
Mhm.
3 or 4 cars back behind psychology, but we were on the train.